The desert is a hostile, barren place to live and make a home. There are no trees, except those that have been planted and watered and carefully tended. Grass and flowers must be coaxed and bribed from the desert floor with precious irrigation water brought from the mountains. The desert is greedy, and it hungrily absorbs all the water and effort poured into it by its inhabitants. But it was in the desert that the Mormon pioneers chose to settle, after persecutions drove them from the United States to the Great Basin. And it was here that pioneer women helped their men to make homes and communities. Making a home in the wilderness was not an easy task. The resources of the desert were meager. Food must be brought from a former home or bartered for along the way. At first, the harvests were scanty and long in coming. The pioneers could afford to let nothing go to waste, least of all their own talents and natural abilities. Perhaps it was in this area, the use of their own native powers, that the early Utah women excelled. The physical demands of pioneer housekeeping were staggering. Nothing was ever in a convenient place. Everything had to be carried to where it was going to be used. The water from the well had to be carried bucket by bucket to the house. Dirty water was carried again in the bucket from the house to the kitchen garden. Wood for the fire must be chopped, then carried in from the woodshed. Ashes were carried out and saved for soap making or spread on the garden for fertilizer. On Mondays, clothing was laundered with water fetched from the well or stream, or clothes and kettles were carried to the creek. As often as not, soft rainwater or melted snow was used to make the soap go further. Then the clean bedding and clothing were hung outside to dry. Tuesday was ironing day, or Wednesday if the clothes froze on the line. And they made time to go visiting frequently. The women were fashion conscious, even in the desert. But not everyone could buy yard goods imported from the States. When necessary, cloth was spun and woven from cotton or from wool shorn from sheep that had been fed and tended for many months. In some homes, not only must clothing be made from start to finish, but bedding, carpeting, soap. Occasionally, the very broom she used to sweep her dirt floor was made by the pioneer woman herself. Thus did the pioneer woman help to make the desert home. But home is more than shelter, food, water, clothing. Home is spirit, and love as well. Mere physical strength is not enough to create such a home as these pioneer women desired. They must have spiritual strength as well. Kathryn Spencer was one woman with such spiritual strength. Driven from Nauvoo by the mob, she became ill almost immediately, suffering from hunger, exposure to bitter cold, and lack of sleep. It became evident that without relief, she would die. Her parents offered to give her shelter if she would but renounce her degrading faith. With true spiritual tenacity, she would not compromise the truth. As her husband queried, "What shall we do?" she asked him to read to her from the Bible.
"Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God."
As he ceased reading, a calm, peaceful smile spread over the face of his wife, and soon her eyelids drooped and closed in the sweet, peaceful sleep of death. Kathryn's legacy to her children was her spirit of testimony and faith. Her legacy to us was her children themselves. Among them was Aurelia Spencer Rogers, who founded the Primary Association that has blessed the lives of children throughout the world for more than 100 years. Kathryn Spencer was only one example of the many women who followed their faith and their prophet. Some gave their lives as she did, but others survived to demonstrate their faith through the day-to-day struggles. Henrietta Williams was one of these. She described an ordinary but trying day on the plains.
They knew I was no cook, but left that job for me anyway. I built a fire after gathering buffalo chips. I made a pie of dried apples, putting it into the oven, and I turned toward the wagon several yards away from the fire. A nice cow sneaked up and helped herself to the pie and sneaked off when a girl called me to look at my rice. I had a hard time cooking the biscuits as I was jumping in and out of the wagon, climbing over the provision box, watching my baby girl, and getting what my husband wanted, as it was his misfortune never to find anything he was looking for. The fire had its own way of burning. I thought, "Oh, Zion, will we ever reach thee?"
Melissa Burton Corey was another whose faith sustained her day by day. When her husband enlisted in the Mormon battalion, she signed on as a laundress, saying,
"If he must go, I want to go too. Why must women always stay behind and worry about their husbands when they could just as well march beside them?"
36 women walked with the Mormon battalion. 32 of them went as far as Santa Fe and then accompanied the sick detachment north to Pueblo. Melissa Corey and 3 others marched all the way to San Diego. During the last part of the trip, Melissa was pregnant. After the battalion was discharged, Melissa and her husband remained for a few months in California. At Monterey, she gave birth to a baby son who lived only a few days. She buried him in California and went on to the Salt Lake Valley with her husband. They had been in Salt Lake only 3 months before Sergeant Corey died. Drusilla Doris Hendricks was another woman whose spiritual strength was taxed to the utmost. A mob at Crooked River, Missouri shot her husband, James.
My husband was shot in the neck, where it cut off all feeling of the body. There's no use for me to try and tell how I felt, for that is impossible. But I could not have shed a tear if all had been dead before me. I went to work to try and get my husband warm, but could not. I rubbed and steamed him, but could get no circulation. He was dead from the neck down.
Through blessings from the Lord and Drusilla's nursing, James partially recovered, although he remained crippled for the rest of his life. Despite these trials, when the time came, Drusilla sent her grown son with the Mormon battalion and took her husband and family west herself. The family made the trip and lived for years on the brink of starvation, sustained by Drusilla's diligence, industry, and faith. Drusilla lists among her efforts to help support her family the following projects, all of them done at home while she cared for her husband and children: washing, sewing, weaving, making gloves, gingerbread, and rope, and taking in boarders. In addition, she supported her invalid husband as bishop of the 19th Ward in Salt Lake for 9 years. At 67, Drusilla wrote,
"The gospel is true. I have rejoiced in it through all my trials, where the Spirit of the Lord has buoyed me up, or I should have failed."
From the earliest winter in the Salt Lake Valley, the relationship with the Indians placed a special burden on the sensibilities of Mormon women. Harriet Young faced a perplexing dilemma that year when an Indian threatened her in her home, built outside the fort. Harriet set the dog on him. The dog bit him on the thigh and fought him to the ground. Harriet took away his weapons before calling off the dog. Then, taking pity on the Indian, she bandaged his wound and sent him on his way. In spite of the differences between the cultures of the Mormons and the Indians, the women were true to their instincts, helping those who were in even greater need than they were. In the early 1850s, unofficial Relief Society groups gathered to sew clothing and make quilts for the Indians. This charitable endeavor was encouraged by Brigham Young, and from these groups, the Relief Society was organized. It was against the twin specters of illness and death that the women waged their most determined campaign. Of particular concern to them, as well as to church leaders, were the untimely deaths of mothers and infants in childbirth. The battle against death and disease was carried on throughout the Mormon colonies, largely by Mormon women. The drive to preserve life in the face of so many threats to life was nearly an obsession with them. They would travel miles at any hour to help sick neighbors, sometimes staying for days until the need for help had passed. Brigham Young encouraged Mormon women to obtain proper medical training to provide the best care for their sister saints. Eliza R. Snow talked with members of the Relief Society, and the women's exponent pleaded for women to respond to that need. At first, only a few courageous women responded. Romania Pratt was one of these. She left 5 sons in the care of her mother to study in Philadelphia. When she returned with her degree, however, her homecoming was bittersweet. She recalled,
I found my dear faithful mother and 2 youngest children gathering fruit. My heart was pierced with sorrow when my little ones opened wide their eyes in wonder and with no token of recognition of their mother. I wept bitterly that I had been forgotten by my babes. Very soon, all my dear children were gathered around me, and we soon renewed old acquaintances and affections.
Ellis Reynolds Shipp and Margaret Curtis Shipp also went east to study medicine. Ellis left her husband and 3 small children in the care of his other wives and went to Philadelphia. Suffering from lack of funds, homesickness, and the discomforts of another pregnancy, she persisted in her studies and came home from Philadelphia with a medical degree and a beautiful baby girl. Eventually, she bore 10 children and raised 5 of them to maturity. These 3, along with other women physicians, taught classes in nursing and midwifery. In sharing the results of their training, these doctors also maintained a strong reliance on the spiritual dimension of medicine. Women from the outlying Mormon colonies as well as the Salt Lake area came to study under these mother-teacher physicians. Amidst it all, persecution, fighting Indians, starvation, and discouragement, these women were willing for their faith's sake to sacrifice much. The comfort of their warm homes in the East, their husbands to missions or the Mormon Battalion, their own time and energy in the East to study medicine. But they were never willing to sacrifice their children on the altar of ignorance. While the first pioneers still lived in the old fort, a 16-year-old girl opened a school in a tent. Mary Jane Dilworth taught school for the first 3 years the saints were in the valley. After she married and her husband was called to the Sandwich Islands as a missionary, Mary Jane picked up her baby and went with him, taking her school to the island natives. Schools and school mistresses were not limited to formal settings alone. Many mothers taught their children in their own homes, carefully preserving the few precious materials from one child to the next. Some learned the few basics at their mother's knee, then went on to the community schools, the Brigham Young Academy, or an Eastern school. Alice Louise Reynolds was an example of many women educators. She graduated from Brigham Young Academy, normal school, in 1890 at the age of 17. At that age, she began her long teaching career, interrupting it for a while to attend the University of Michigan. At 22, she returned to teach at Brigham Young Academy. She taught at the Y for 44 years and became a full professor at the university. These women who came to build their new homes in the wilderness had left much behind them in the East. They were filled with an urgent desire to endow life with beauty and culture. Living in a covered wagon was no barrier to genteel living. Bathsheba W. Smith reported,
I had hanging up in the inside a looking glass, candlestick, pincushion, and so forth. To the center of our wagon, we had room for 4 chairs. The floor of our traveling house was carpeted, and we made ourselves as comfortable as we could under the circumstances.
John Taylor's company, somewhat discouraged at encountering snow the first week in September, were cheered by the ladies who brought out their fine linens and china when they met Brigham Young's party returning east. They served a fat heifer with fish and fruits and jellies. After the meal, a dance was held. Songs and recitations were interspersed between the dances. The women's exponent was another answer to the women's desire to share cultural experiences. Its stated aim was to discuss every subject interesting and valuable to women, current news, household hints, educational matters, articles on health and dress, and miscellaneous reading. The first editor of the Exponent was Lula Green Richards, wife and mother. She resigned her post after 5 years of service, when the demands at home conflicted too greatly with the requirements of the Exponent. She said,
Every reflecting mother and every true philanthropist can see the happy medium between being selfishly homebound and foolishly public-spirited.
42 years after its beginning, the Women's Exponent became the Relief Society magazine. They kept busy, these Mormon women, at home and in the community. The necessities of the time demanded that each person do whatever tasks his or her abilities and the situation required. When the growing community acquired a telegraph, women were called by Brigham Young to be operators. 3 of these were childhood friends from Nephi, just 15 years old. During off hours, they telegraphed notes to each other, keeping up friendly visits over the wires. As the economy expanded, a few women worked as clerks and accountants. Some raised silkworms, others made bonnets. Many women raised chickens and gardens. One woman, Georgie Snow, was admitted to the bar in 1872. 3 women served in the state legislature before the turn of the century. One of these, Martha Hughes Cannon, was the first woman state senator in the United States. Each woman contributed according to her strength and abilities. These early Utah women were blessed and strengthened by the Lord and the gospel of Jesus Christ. In turn, they blessed and strengthened their families and their communities. The Mormon pioneers came to the desert valley and made it blossom as a rose. The credit for this accomplishment must go to each individual pioneer man, woman, and child who planted a flower or a tree, who built a house or a church, who led the water through the canals and ditches to the barren desert earth, and who knew that the desert must be made not only to blossom, the desert must be made home.